downward facing dog. Again, if you look at it anatomically, downward facing dog is an arm balance in a sense in that we are weight bearing on the hands. So we often see a lot of issues stemming from not just the shoulder joint, but what we're doing with our hands and elbows as well, and without even getting into the pelvis. So if you want to come down onto your hands and knees, Tasha, and then tuck your toes under, lift the hips up for a downward facing dog. And so typically the language we hear sometimes in the yoga studios is that, you know, your index finger needs to be pointing forward, the inside of the forearms need to be facing each other, the elbows wrapping. I sort of take all of those rules and throw them aside, because what I'm most concerned with is the shoulder joint. And so what happens for some people is that if we try to set their arms up, and Tasha's not one of those people, but I've worked with several of them, if we set our hands up so they're perfectly straight and we get too focused on what's happening with the arms, in order for that to happen is they have to do this. Which means what they're doing is they're taking the head of their humerus and they're rotating it in their arm and then weight bearing on it. Without getting into any of the major anatomy of all the stuff inside the shoulder joint, that's just really not a good scenario for anything, the tendons, the ligaments, or the bursa sacs. So stuff like that will eventually lead to tendonitis, arthritis, bursitis, basically any type of inflammation. So we want to be focusing on this joint. And now the same thing we talked about in push-up, plank, or chaturanga dandasana needs to be applied here. So if Tasha just comes forward onto her toes into a plank position, she might have to walk her feet back. And so we want to set up the shoulders up almost exactly the same. So squeezing the shoulder blades together, pushing into the floor, pulling the shoulder blades apart, sliding the hands away from each other, and then wrapping her elbows. And then as best she can, she holds on to this stability of the shoulders, pulls the low belly in, starts to lift the tailbone up. Good, and then she comes into a position. So you'll see right away what she did once she got stuck here is instead of doing this and jamming herself further, which would be compromising her shoulder joint, is she stopped where her body wanted to stop because her shoulders are great, they're strong, they're set up here, and instead she took her feet in. Because the second Tasha takes her feet back, so start stepping your feet back, and keep stepping them back, keep stepping them back, and what you'll start to notice is this joint starts to change a little bit. So step your feet back in until you feel like you're really strong in your shoulders. Eventually where this pose goes is if she continues to push down into the floor, wraps the upper back even a little bit more. So she can even bend the elbows just a little bit, like she's trying to touch her head onto the floor. So bend the elbow, good. And now wrap your elbows together and now straighten the arms. So she's really plugged in, beautiful. Her shoulder blades, I don't know if you could see that, really plugged in down the back line of the body. And now I'll tell Tasha to take another step closer to her hands. Another step closer to her hands. And then she's going to lift her gaze and just look to her hands. This looks a lot like handstand. And so what she can do now is slightly bend the elbows. You'll see how she starts to lose the wrap. Slightly bend the elbows, wrap them back, straighten the arms. Another reason why she'll start to lose the wrap is the same thing we saw in downward facing dog. So what she can do is bend the knees, take another step forward. Beautiful. And so her bum stays lifted over her head, and now that if she wanted to, because there's not a wall here, albeit her wall, is instead of jumping up and flailing through her legs, she can lean into it, push down into the floor, her shoulders are plugged in, and her feet come up. And then slowly press down. Step back into downward facing dog. So what we can see, and then from downward facing dog, go back into chaturanga, or high plank. What we can see in all these positions, back to downward facing dog. Step your feet in, and back into handstand. Shift the weight, plug in, and gently press up. What we can see in all of these positions is that the shoulders are essentially doing the same thing. Gently back down, and downward facing dog. Child's pose. So a few other things we commonly see in downward facing dog either stem from the way the actual shoulder is set up, because what we can see from different bodies is they all have different bone structure. If you're interested in looking more into that, if you go to paulgreeley.com, this is the Yin Yoga website, he's got various pictures of different bone slides that show that depending on the person, the scapula might look different, the collarbone looks different, the transverse processes of the spine look different, and the pelvis and even the femur, the leg bone, well, that's the hand, even that looks different. And so because all of our bone shapes are different, it's going to affect the actual aesthetics or the appearance of the pose. So what we might often see, and I've seen this typically in some men that I've worked with, more so than women, but I've seen it in women as well, is the ability to lift the arms straight up overhead, and that we literally get stuck. And so as I raise my arms up over my head, when I get stuck, it can either be two things. It can be the tightness in the lats, which we see quite often, especially those people who work out a lot. They're naturally going to be really tight through this part of the body. And the way you'll know it's tightness in the lats is because they'll tell you they feel stretching. Another thing that we might feel is we actually get stuck because we're running so our arm bone's either running into part of our clavicle that's sticking out or part of our scapula, our shoulder blade that's sticking out and forward. And so what happens when we do that is if we're actually running into the shoulder blade, if I keep lifting up into it, or say in downward facing dog, if I keep pushing through, is that eventually this becomes a lever on my shoulder blade and my shoulder blade will start to lift, which can be okay if it's comfortable, but you might have people who are complaining about muscles pinching and tenderness sort of radiating in the back or underneath of the shoulder. So that could definitely be an issue. So if Tasha wants to come into the pose, we'll just see what that looks like. One of the ways people can get around this compression they're finding when they run into themselves, so into their bony structure here, is by taking the arms around, so abducting around that joint. So what we might see, so if Tasha was one of those people and she kind of gets stuck, this is what we see, and so we push on them and they're not going anywhere. Don't push on them. That's a good indication that, again, she's sort of stuck on her shoulders. So what I could suggest, and we might look at that and think it's uncomfortable, but if she's like, no, this actually feels really great, then I would say, cool, this is what your downward dog looks like. If, however, it's uncomfortable, she feels like she's pinching in through the neck, the upper traps here, what I would suggest is that she comes down to her knees and see if she can't take the arms a little wider. So here that, your index finger needs to be right underneath your shoulders. That alignment rule might just have to go for this situation. And then once the arms are wider, if she comes back up and tucks her toes under, if she's then able to push a little bit deeper, then you sort of know that was the issue. Another issue that we often see, and we're always telling people to straighten their arms, is we do find that some people have their arms a little bit bent to the side. Again, I'm not as concerned with what's happening here unless they're complaining about pain or discomfort. We're more concerned about here. So again, working this idea of wrapping of the shoulders and staying really protected. It could also be an issue that isn't even involved in the shoulder. Where the problem could be coming from is from tightness in the backs of the legs, so in the hamstrings, which we see commonly in a lot of people. So the tailbone starts to tuck, the hamstring get really, really short. Could also be some tightness in the back of the lower legs. Essentially, this entire system is connected together. So the idea that each of these individual muscles work separately isn't really the case, the way the body moves. And so one of the things, if she looks really restricted in the pose and I'm asking her if she can come a little bit deeper, if she's kind of stuck, I might say, okay, well, bend your knees. And so she bends the knees, that loosens the slack on the back of the body, allowing me to then assist her in getting the tailbone up. So she's reaching up through the pelvis. So it takes the pelvis, and instead of it being tipped down, it lifts it up. Again, there may be an issue with bone structure. Some people can only tip their pelvis to a certain degree, so not everybody can get their tailbone straight up. It depends on what's happening at the front of the hip bones as well. But then with your knees bent, you'll see that a lot of people, so keep your knees bent, Tasha, a lot of people may be able to get a better positioning in through their downward facing dog. And then from there, once they're in this better position, you can ask them to start to straighten their legs. You may see right away as people straighten their legs that all sorts of weird things happen with the shoulders, the hands, the spine, so this is just compensation. It's what we do in our body to sort of deflect discomfort. And slowly come down to the knees. Ultimately, in these postures, downward facing dog, it's less about what the pose actually looks like and more what we're feeling in the posture. So downward facing dog, we're working on a really nice stretch over the entire back line of the body. So the idea is to set ourselves up in the pose that our joints are really sort of stable. So that's stirrup. They're very stable, but we're also able to access a really nice stretch over the entire body. So we're never sacrificing this really of the joint for depth in the posture or for the aesthetics of the posture.